Yeah, good evening, everyone. It's nice to see everyone, in good shape, good health, and George looking very smart as well. So this is vitreomacular traction and MIPI retinal membranes that I'll be talking about. And this is probably the third year we are talking on this same topic. So VMTS is when the liquefaction and dehiscence of vitreoretinal interface do not match, and it results in an anomalous PVD. So VMTS is distortion of the fovea without full thickness interruption of the retinal layers. And it could be focal, less than 1500 microns, which may be known as, which sometimes called as vitreofoveal traction, or it could be broad, more than 1500 microns. There could be concurrent VMT as well, that could be associated with macular abnormalities in diabetic retinopathy, etc. VMA is elevation of cortical vitreous above the retinal surface without actually any change in the foveal contour. So these are asymptomatic cases. Anomalous PVD can lead to vitreoskisis, exudative ARMD, retinal tears, etc. So the pathogenesis is breakdown of the BRB, disturbance of macular microcirculation, and CME. The symptoms are decreased visual acuity, metamorphosia, micropsia, and all other sorts of things, which leads to difficulty in routine work. The complications can lead to macular holes, ERMs, and foveoskisis. The diagnosis, the mainstay is the OCT, the tool we all use routinely in our clinics, and it is graded as incomplete PVD with attachment at fovea, grade 1. Grade 2 is when the appearance of retinal cyst or clefts. Grade 3, when there are subretinal fluid as well. So the treatment of tractional macular edema is, sometimes we come across spontaneous resolution, which is quite infrequent though. It is 11% at 15 months of time. Mainstay of therapy is surgical, and it can be performed with or without removal. Gas injections have been found to be successful in few cases, and the highest rate has been 60% at 3 months. There's a lot of buzz about opriplasmin, which is about pharmacologic vitriolysis. So MIBI trust showed release rate of 26.5% in VMA at 28 days, better in young phakic patients with focal attachments without any ERM. The outcomes depend upon morphology and duration. So we show you a video of VMT. Thanks to Dr. Saravanan for this video. All the videos are provided by him, and he's a surgeon as well. So this is how we remove the VMT. But despite a good surgery, sometimes in the VMT, we may not have the outcome as expected. So simultaneously, subsequently I'll show you the ERM peeling videos, because the surgical, the maneuvers are almost the same. So once you remove the vitreous, the ERM is removed using a forceps here. So this is a simple case of ERM removal. Sometimes you come across very tough ERMs where there is a chance of de-roofing of fovea. So one has to, there's an animation simultaneously that will run the how we can avoid de-roofing of fovea. You can see that if you pull it just like that, there could be an appearance of macular hole. So what you need to do is you remove from all the sides. And gently peel it off without actually de-roofing the fovea. So this is an important step. So no surgery to be done in haste. It should be carefully done. You see, if you pull like this, see, there is a chance of de-roofing, there's a traction there. So remove from all the other sides, and then clear the ERM. There's another tough ERM where it was very difficult to find a cleft and peel it off. So a dye was used to stain the ILM, of course the brilliant blue dye, and then the ERM was removed along with the ILM. Let me move it faster. See, this ILM is being peeled off. And along with this, the ERM is also separated. So we all know that epiretinal membranes are the cellular proliferation on the inner retinal surface, and this usually results after PVD. The most common cause for ERM is the PVD. So it can be classified as idiopathic secondary or iatrogenic, and it is bilateral in up to 31% of cases. The prevalence is 7 to 12%. And it was significantly increased after cataract surgery. So it is important instruction to all the cataract surgeons that they should explain to the patient. And the peak age usually results from 70 to 79 years, and it is more common in females. So we will discuss here before going into other details of ERM, the interesting type of lamellar hole associated epiretinal proliferation, or LHEP. This is ST-OCT finding of homogeneous membrane of moderate reflectivity. It's an epiretinal membrane without evidence of traction, has visible connections to the middle layers, thinner fovea and higher prevalence of ellipsoid zone disruption, have poorer visual outcome. And exact pathogenesis still not known, could be a result of associated retinal injury. So these are the few photographs of LHEP. It's a lamellar macular hole. So there's a post-surgery. And this is 1 month post-surgery. It fills it up, though outcome is not very good. The clinical features, symptoms range from none to decreased vision, monocular diplopia or metamorphosia, CME, hemorrhage, heart exit, etc. It could break down of BRB, and may be associated with macular hole and pseudo holes. So this is what we are talking about as the macular holes. You can grade macular holes also 0, 1, 2, depending upon their appearance. It could be select fund maculopathy, irregular wrinkling of inner retina, opaque membrane obscuring the underlying vessels, and retinal distortion. Pathogenesis, we all know that it is 53% under 50 years and 65% over 65 years have PVD. It leads to secondary glasses. And in the absence of PVD, chronic irritation of molar cells leads to glasses, that is mechanical glasses, and ERM formation takes place. The diagnostic investigations of for ERM mainstay is the OCT again, and FFA is useful tool in cases of underlying vascular events or CNV. As I showed in the videos, that it's a mainstay of treatment is the surgical treatment, and indications usually is vision less than 6/18 or disturbing diplopia and metamorphosia. The prognostic factors are preoperative visual acuity, centrofoveal thickness, integrity of ellipsoid zone, and the outcomes are usually improvement of 2 or more lines in 6 to 12 months, improvement in contrast sensitivity, and stereopsis adds to quality of life. The pre-existing macular pathology may limit the outcome. We have already seen the surgical technique, no need to elaborate on that. Thank you very much. Over to you, Abhijit.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Abhijit, over to you. Where is Abhijit?
Yeah, I'm audible.
Yeah, of course, very much. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the nice presentation, Dr. Rajesh. So this is our basically the order in which we will call the speakers. So number 2 is me, then number 3, Dr. George, with management of failed macular hole surgery. Number 4 is Dr. Saravanan. Number 6, Dr. Naresh Babu, and will be wrapped up by Dr. B.S. Saravanan, and after that we will have panel discussion. Okay, so now I will present my slides, and yeah, so this is the macular hole in attached and detached retina. So the first described by Knapp in 1869 about the macular hole, and modern concept and classification by
Abhijit, you have to share your screen.
yeah. Now it is sharing.
No, sir. Not yet.
Is it okay? No.
No, sir.
Share. Now?
Yeah, got it. Got it.
Yeah. So, is it okay now?
Yeah, slides are seen.
Yeah. Thank you. So, the subject is macular hole in attached and detached retina. So, the first concept described by Knapp in 1869 and modern concept and classification by Gass, and prevalence from 3.3% in Baltimore study to 1.7% in South India study, and bilaterally in up to 11% cases. So first reported of macular hole surgery in archives of 1991 by Kelly and Wendell, and the success rate came up from reported 58% to now about 95%, nearly 100%. So diagnosis initially Sidler magnetoscopy and replaced by OCT nowadays. And there is a classification of the macular hole, which I am not going into details. And Dr. Rajesh went through it. Stage 0 to macular hole, which is OCT classification, and then at stage 1 is the impending macular holes. Stage 1B is impending macular hole with biomicroscopically yellow ring with bridging interface, loss of foveolar dispersion, and no retrofoveolar separation. Stage 2 is macular hole is eccentric, oval, crescent, or horseshoe retinal defect inside edge of retinal of yellow ring, central round retinal defect retina with or without foveolar opacity. Stage 3 and 4, I am not going to get now. And this is the classification of commonly used for full thickness macular hole, which is the indication of surgeries. So there is a small hole, large hole, and the full thickness macular hole with the PVD. And this is the OCT pictures of the stage 1A, stage 1B, and the impending holes. So what is the prognostic indicators of macular hole? The lots of prognostic indicators are there in lots of different journals, but the most important ones are like the macular hole minimal hole diameter at the base, and also there is the hole form factor and macular hole index and tractional hole index. So for the surgery, we use the few dyes and the few adjuvants and the instruments, the triamcinolone, and then we graduated to immunosaline green, trypan blue, and nowadays we use brilliant blue dye. Adjuvants, there are lots of adjuvants described like autologous serum, tissue adhesives, transforming growth factor, thrombin, and now we use the reverse flaps like the ILM tissue and also even the retinal tissue graft. So instruments, ILM forceps, diamond dust scraper, Fenecer loop, PIC, and even under PFC we do. So there is the one, this is the inverse flap technique which we showed here, and 65-year-old male and pseudophakic. Here we can see the 25-day vitrectomy we did, and after the vitrectomy with triamcinolone assisted PVD induction, and then stained with the brilliant blue dye. And here we use the Fenecer loop. From all around, we pick it up and slowly foxing and cajoling into the macular hole. And then with the cutter, we trimmed it. And you can see we are trimming it so that it will be easier to put it inside the hole. And then we do the fluid exchange, and we can see the flap will go automatically inside the holes. but we should be careful and should not go very near to the hole while using the extrusion. Otherwise, the flap may come inside the extrusion. And there is a traumatic macular hole. There's an extensive scarring of retinal tissue involving the foveal inferior part, long duration of the macular hole. Here you can see the inferior nasal part, and the half of the foveal tissue is gone. And here the other half portion where the tissue is there, we picked up the island with the loop, because we are very careful here not to disturb the island tissue, because this type of cases I thought maybe the island may help better way. That's why it is done. Otherwise, previously we used to take out the island fully without any tissue flap, and then as before we trimmed it, and then we did a fluid exchange. And here we can see the post-operative fovea, and also the OCT showing the hole closure. Then there is a temporal flap technique where we are not pulling the tissue from all over, only the temporal tissues, temporal ILM is filled up by the ILM forceps under the brilliant blue staining. And you can see we keep the nasal flaps. Maybe if it is a failed dose surgery, you can always use that thing as a graft tissue. And basically, this flap technique decreased our operation time tremendously, because we don't have to peel so much. Nowadays, in fact, we don't peel that much amount also. Only the 1/3 amount of island you can peel and put it, and it closes nicely. And again, you the same thing, fluid exchange. And this is the retinal detachment with macular hole surgery. And this is the old macular retinal detachment. You can see the subretinal bands are there. So after the vitrectomy and transluminal and the induction, we made 3 retinotomies, and the connected subretinal bands are taken out. And we put PFCL also. You can see the jelly-like old subretinal fluid coming out. And we settled it a little bit. Otherwise, you cannot put the PFCL enough to feel the ILM comfortably. And then below the PFCL, you can stain it with the brilliant blue, and immediately you can start peeling, because it stains naturally immediately. And with the ILM forceps, you can see comfortably you can take out the ILM. And then after the fluid exchange and removing the PFCL, we just laser the retinotomies all around. So this is the result. You can see this is the silicone oil. Below that, the OCT we have done, so the media is not so clear. But you can see the hole is closed nicely, and you can see the tissue of the ILM. In fact, the macular hole tissue is slowly filling up. The outer retinal layers is already formed nicely. Thank you. So our next speaker is that will be speaking about the management of the failed.
You have to stop
Yeah.
sharing.
Yes. Yeah, Dr. George, please.
Yeah. Is my screen visible, Dr. Abhijit?
Yes,
Yeah,
you
it
are.
is.
Yeah. Okay. So we have seen all sorts of macular holes being treated. So now let us look at management of the failed macular hole surgery. So before going on to what is failed macular hole surgery, what is a successful macular hole surgery? It is a closure of the foveal defect with continuous retinal layers and an intact ellipsoid zone of the photoreceptor. So this is a type 1 closure. Type 2 closure could be V-type or U-type. V-type, as you can see here, or a U-type where the edges of the hole is attached to the RPE, but there is a central foveal defect. It's a failed macular hole surgery. These such small macular holes tend to close from top to bottom. And so these small outer lamellar defects cannot be called a failed macular hole surgery because it might take long periods for it to close these defects. So being said, now failed macular hole surgery, it is assumed that adequate ILM peeling, as shown by Dr. Abhijit, has been done and adequate gas tamponade is given. So which are the ones which fail after the first surgery? Obviously, as shown, large macular holes like this, greater than 800 microns minimum hole diameter, chronic macular holes with RPE changes and such subretinal precipitates, myopic staphylomatous macular holes, and large traumatic macular holes. So now let us look at some of the techniques that is used for this failed macular holes. The first is the inverted flap technique. This is basically to prevent a failure of large macular holes. The simplest procedure is repeat fluid gas exchange done in early failure of macular holes. The commonest procedure is free ILM flap technique. And now people are using lens capsular flap transplant, and rarely in staphylomatous failed myopic macular holes, full thickness retinal free flap is also used in failed macular hole surgery. Rarely amniotic membrane transplant and arcuate retinotomies are also done to close the failed macular holes. So inverted flap technique is better to prevent the failure of macular hole surgery. So it was first described by Navraki. And in this technique, these ILM, which is multiple ILM flaps are taken from the arcade radially towards till the edge of the macular holes, and it is kept over the macular hole, because this ILM flaps not only acts as a scaffold for the migration of the Mueller cells and closure of the macular hole, it also releases neurotrophic factors and helps in the survival of the retinal neurons and photoreceptors. So multiple of such flaps are taken, and these flaps are brought till the very edge of the macular hole, and then it is trimmed with low suction cutting, so that only the adequate amount to cover the macular hole is left. And after a fluid air exchange using a soft tip cannula, these flap is generally nudged to cover the macular hole, and a long-acting gas tamponade is given at the end of the procedure. So the simplest procedure being a repeat fluid gas exchange. As mentioned, early surgical failure, usually within the 2 weeks of surgery, if it's an inadequate gas tamponade or poor positioning by the patient, usually the fashion will be like this: raised cuff of subretinal fluid and edematous lip of the macular hole. So these are examples where only a fluid air exchange and a longer acting C3F8 gas is used, and a type 1 closure of these macular holes have been achieved. So the commonest procedure after a failed surgery is taking a small flap from the edge of the already peeled area of ILM and placing it slightly larger than the macular hole diameter and putting it over the macular hole, so that again it acts as a scaffold for Mueller cell migration. So this is actually a modification of this free flap technique, wherein normally perfluorocarbon liquid bubble is not used in the original technique, and here it is being stained. BBG staining is done under the PFCL. Why it is done is because after taking this flap from the already peeled area of ILM, the ILM is quite flimsy and light, so it will float around in the vitreous. So, and that is what makes this procedure a little bit difficult. So this modification of peeling it under the PFCL bubble and then just dragging it towards the macula, not lifting it out of the PFCL bubble. So this is the way to put it on the macula, and with soft tip cannula, can gently nudge it to the macular hole area, and a careful fluid air exchange is done with low air pressure and taking out all the fluid above the PFCL bubble so that it doesn't cause turbulence and loss of the flap kept over the macular hole, and long-acting tamponade is given. A small modification of this technique is a hinged flap. Hinged flap is again to prevent the loss of this flap after keeping on the macula. It is hinged at the edge of the already peeled area of hilum. As you can see the clinical photo, it is kept over the macular hole before putting the gas, longer acting gas tamponade. So also now it is a common practice to do if it's a combined phaco surgery, or as in this case, it's a pseudophakic case. Pinching a small piece of the posterior capsule which is stained with trypan blue, and it should be slightly larger than the macular hole diameter. And if the point is to put a drop of viscoelastic outside so that it doesn't float like this in the vitreous cavity, though it is more thicker and heavier than the ILM flap, this can be kept over the macular hole, so that this also acts as a scaffold and happens to close the macular hole. And once it is kept over position, fluid air exchange is done and gas tamponade is given. So as you can see here, after 2 weeks, the capsular flap is still there. And around a month later, almost a type 1 closure is achieved under the lens capsular flap. So here, since it's a combined phaco surgery along with failed macular hole surgery, after the capsular excess, this anterior capsular flap is preserved and kept moistened on a petri dish until you proceed with the phaco surgery, and then go ahead with the sclerotomies and do a fluid air exchange. You can hand fashion this capsule to a size slightly larger than the macular hole diameter, and put a drop of viscoelastic on this capsular flap before taking it into the vitreous cavity, and then go and place it over the macular hole. So as you can see here, it is placed over the macular hole with viscoelastic. It prevents from getting displaced during the gas injection or subsequent positioning of the patient. So here at the end of 1 month, you can see still it acts as a scaffold and allows the migration of Muller cells to close the macular hole. So an extreme procedure, but in refractory myopic large macular hole in a staphyloma situation, it's very challenging in a failed surgery to get this ILM flap again because of the extreme tessellation of the fundus. In such situation, from the supratemporal equatorial region under perfluorocarbon liquid, full thickness retinal flap is taken after cauterizing the vessels around it, and it is lifted and dragged under the PFCL so that the side of the retina should be correct when you place it on the macular hole. So you can see that a failed hole, and once the flap is kept over the macular hole, after 1 month, the tissue is taken up and there is a closure of such staphylomatous macular hole, and the tissue is taken. Steve Charles described arcuate, C-shaped temporal arcuate retinotomy, because we know the nerve fiber bundles are arranged around, above and below the horizontal raphe in a C-shaped fashion. So this kind of a retinotomy do not injure the nerve fiber bundle, and with a soft tip cannula, this retinal bridge is displaced nasally, so the horizontal diameter is reduced and help in the closure of the failed macular holes. So he has shown the closure and the healing of the retinotomy without scarring here, and there is no scotoma on visual field examination. Also, another procedure described is sparing the papillomacular bundle, the temporal half full thickness radial incision around one hole diameter from the edge of the macular hole. These relaxing radial incision also help in closing the failed macular hole. So we have already seen that some of the adjuvants like viscoelastic, autologous whole blood, autologous platelet concentrate, these help basically in dislocation, prevent the dislocation of the transplanted tissue, be it ILM or capsular flap or whatever, helps in the acting as a scaffold and closure. So to conclude, the above described techniques prove useful, especially for large and refractory macular hole, which in the past had a poor surgical outcome. So these novel techniques reveal advancement in surgical techniques with better anatomic outcomes. So long-term visual outcomes have to be analyzed in larger studies. Thank you for listening.
Excellent, Dr. George. So now we go to the next speaker, Dr. Hiya Saravanan sir, and that is about the macular hole and schisis in myopia, optic nerve pit, and subretinal perfluorocarbon liquid. Dr. Saravanan sir.
I'll just share my able to see my slides?
Yes,
Are my slides progressing?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, you can.
Yes.
So one of the occasional diseases which we see in our retina clinic is myopic traction maculopathy, which is a very subtle finding, which is usually only picked up clearly on OCT. Especially when you have a high myopia patient with unexplained vision loss, always don't hesitate to do a OCT to visualize the posterior pole disorders. Here I'm showing various degrees of a myopic traction maculopathy, or MTM as it's popularly called. You can see here the early taut posterior hyaloid phase is there. And here you can see the early effects of the traction on the inverse of the retina. And you can here in the top picture, you can see the early skytic changes, and which is getting more and more increase in these eyes. We are seeing a significant amount of myopic macular schisis in the top picture. And the bottom picture, you have a posterior pole RD with a myopic schisis and a large macular hole as well. So various names have been given to the entity, but right now MTM or myopic traction maculopathy is one of the more popularly used terminology here. Here you can see myopic CNVM along with the myopic macular schisis. We can see a very well delineated dot macular schisis, splitting of the inner layer into thin strips. Various theories have been proposed, but main thing is that traction from the taut internal limiting membrane from the blood vessels, taut in short retina, and also the elongated sclera just not conform to the retinal curvature. So all these have been proposed as causes for this traction maculopathy. So various techniques have been described to take care of this. First has been the vitrectomy with the internal limiting membrane peeling by Panozzo et al. They showed that peeling the internal limiting membrane helped to relieve the traction and attach the macula. In some of these cases, it took a long time period to reattach the retina. Following this, Spade proposed that only the hyaloid phase is the more important structure clinically, and he demonstrated a success in patients where he did not remove the ILM and removed known as a aiding agent. Here, there is not the presence of the posterior skytic phase is almost transparent and very thin. You can see here there's a posterior pole RD of the large macular hole. We have put already a PFCL bubbles there inside, and I'm staining the ILM using BBG dye under the PFCL. Here I'm picking up the ILM and trying to peel, and I realized that at this point there's something which hindering a transparent membrane, as you can see there. And that is the residual hyaloid phase, posterior phase, which is very thin and transparent, unlike what you would normally see in a routine patient. So in almost all high myopic patients, what feels like a PVD is not truly a PVD. Now I'm peeling the ILM after the peeling of the hyaloid. So always make sure that you identify the thin hyaloid membrane below the so-called PVD. So always assume that this membrane is there and address it. Also, some people have tried supporting by placing various types of from PLOM to the modern Devin implant and all. People have used the silicon sponge dental wires, just showing the Andos PLOM surgery. You can see after doing a vitrectomy intermembrane peeling, here is the endolimiter to aid in the central placement right beneath the fovea. And this is the PLOM which is sutured the arms of the plumb are just sutured just below the lateral like this. And you can see the lighting up that indicate the correct position. Two temporal portion will support, two nasal portion can include the optic nerve. Some of the pictures of success following surgery. So this is one case where people are not well versed in macular buckle. We can do an intentional retinal sleeve. This is one of our cases who came with a posterior pole RD with the myopic macular schisis, and after vitrectomy, she developed actually the preoperative posterior staphyloма, and postoperatively she developed detachment with a large detachment with the iatrogenic macular hole. And this is a surgical video showing the. So here we did an intentional, almost temporal 180-degree vitrectomy. And then inferior and temporal retinectomy to release the retina now for intentional slippage. And the ILM was very thin and was not able to peel it clear. So we just did the retinal graft. You can see the trimming of the peripheral retina, inferior retina, and then dragging this onto the fovea and using this as a retrograft to block the hole. And this is the laser of the retinectomy, and this is the postoperative picture showing the large retinectomy and the attached. This is the OCT showing the attached retina, and now the retina is conforming to the deep staphyloма because we have created intentional retinal slippage. So all these techniques have been described and can be used to address this etiology. Next is the optic disc pit. Again, is not a very common disorder, but we're going to see it often in pure retina practice. And the success has not been that very great with the conventional techniques. Many things have been tried. The source of the sciatic vitreous fluid, it enters the intraretinal space through the defect in the optic nerve. So people are various, but the seepage from the vitreous into the intraretinal subretinal. People try to laser the temporal edge of the ONHP and to variable success, but not that very great. And also people have tried using gas into the vitreous cavity by pushing to take care of this, tamponade the optic nerve pit, and varied success have been reported technique also. People done vitrectomy with the ILM peeling, with the ILM graft over the like this. First, initially only plain ILM peeling was done. ILM grafting as well as scleral grafting. Spade also, in one of the cases, they described the inner retinal fixations, creating multiple retinotomies at the bundle area to allow the fluid to exit back into the vitreous cavity. So various sealants have been used, and now commonly prefers the ILM graft and then the scleral graft here. You can see here the ILM is just left onto the optic disc. So this is a fovea involving ILM peeling, which you can go into iatrogenic macular this case. So nowadays we started to do a fovea sparing ILM peeling to avoid this iatrogenic macular hole. So this one child around 10 years old boy. So you can see the ILM staining and the fovea sparing flap, which is then lifted onto the optic disc pit, and then gas is injected to tamponade this. So more recently, the best success has been with the place scleral graft on the this. We have seen better success compared to ILM flap. So you have to fashion the graft according to the size of the pit, and then this pushed into the optic disc pit, and then either oil or tamponade is done depending upon the age group. So there's some of the successes following surgery. And last is the subretinal PF. So migration can happen in the presence of large breaks, posterior breaks, a taut retina where the retina inherence or because of extensive proliferative membrane which has not been addressed, bubbling due to intraocular pressure or due to exchange instruments, and also very gross retina during surgery. We can see that during exchange of instruments, see the presence of bubble here, and then so small bubbles can migrate. So how to this once when you see in the postoperative period, the ideal time is to remove as early as possible. So this can go to permanent scota if it is left alone. Commonest technique, very small bubble, is to iatrogenic bulle of RD by injecting BSS in the submacular space, and then using the tip trying to push this into the central cavity. And while trying to aspirate, this can be removed with action cannula. So here you can see we have a 49 gauge med1 needle. You can use that to inject to create the RD. If they don't have a med needle, you you can use the 30 gauge needle, which is hooked onto an intramuscular 24 gauge needle, and you can create your own contrapture. Here you can see that the BS is injected slowly into the submacular space, and once they mobilize the PFCL bubble into the center of the bullae, then we aspirate to come out on its own. Second technique is if the large hole, you can directly aspirate here. If it's a large hole, you can directly make a nick at the edge of the there you don't, because it's difficult to remove, you can create inferior bullae and then push the PFC bull into the center and allow the patient to sit so that the gravitational and the pressure will push it from up to down. And the gravity will pull the bubble. So it will be, even though it is in the macula, it will be off the fovea, is the critical zone. So all techniques can be tried for dealing with the plain subretinal PFC. Thank you. If there are questions, we can at the end of all the talks. I'll stop sharing and probably Abhijit can take over.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Saravanan, for the excellent talk. I got a few questions also, but I think we will better discuss them after the finishing of this all the talks. So now, Dr. Shloka Sipal, I should invite him for his talk on submacular hemorrhage, antivascular endothelial growth factor, tissue plasminogen activator, and gas. Yeah, we can see it.
We can see your slides now. We're not able to hear you, Shubhankar Sri.
Yes, sir. Good evening. I'll be discussing submacular hemorrhage, the role of TPA, gas, and anti-VEGF. Thank you, IOC, again, and Dr. Abhijit for this opportunity. So, submacular hemorrhage is the hemorrhage in the potential space between the neurosensory retina and the RPE, mainly caused by the neovascular AMD, TCV, retinal artery macroaneurysm, trauma, myopia, angioid strips. It may lead to photoreceptor damage within 24 hours by shearing of outer segment of photoreceptor, impaired transport of nutrients, direct toxicity by iron, fibrin, and hemosiderin. So timely intervention is required. There are various treatment options available: anti-VEGF monotherapy, pneumatic displacement with anti-VEGF, intravitreal TPA with anti-VEGF with pneumatic displacement, pars plana vitrectomy with subretinal TPA, and subretinal or intravitreal pneumatic displacement. So natural history usually has got a very poor visual outcome. There is no gold standard treatment. Monotherapy with anti-VEGF had shown some success. Anti-VEGF treats the underlying pathology. Expansile gas causes mechanical displacement of the blood from the fovea. So it has got faster visual recovery. Even it may cause flattening of hemorrhagic PEDs. It also allows to view the underlying pathology and perform the related investigation and treatment. Anti-VEGF with gas has shown better result. No head-to-head prospective trial. A CAT trial subgroup of submacular hemorrhage had favorable outcome. TPA was described by Wilson Harriet with intravitreal dose of 50 microgram in 0.1 ml, which catalyzes breakdown of plasminogen to plasmin to cause clot lysis, liquefies subretinal clot, and hasten resorption of pre-existing hemorrhage. Intravitreal TPA with or without gas or anti-VEGF result is very good in small hemorrhage with shorter duration. Subretinal TPA with concentration of 10 micrograms in 0.1 ml following vitrectomy used in large, long-standing and more severe form of hemorrhage causes chemical lysis of clot with minimal mechanical trauma. Ocular side effects are photoreceptor cell loss, RP pigmentary changes, exudative retinal detachment, and hemorrhage. Vitrectomy allows a larger gas bubble. There are some studies showing 3-line improvement in 66% of the cases, but there is no clear difference in view of visual recovery between vitrectomy with subretinal TPA versus intravitreal TPA without vitrectomy. It has an advantage of subretinal pneumatic displacement, which exerts higher pressure and more effective after TPA-assisted clot lysis. Prolonged face down positioning is not required, less chance of rise in IOP. But there is some cases of high risk of macular hole formation. Vitrectomy subretinal TPA with PFCL has been used to displace subfoveal blood. I will be discussing few cases. First case of a female of 55-year-old which came with 15 days history of decreased vision with 636 vision, known hypertensive. She came with a large submacular hemorrhage and OCT is also showing multiple PEDs and subfoveal hemorrhage. She was first treated with injection 100% C3F8 with ranibizumab. 2 weeks post-injection, vision improved to 6/18, but still there was persistent hemorrhage. So injection TPA was given intravitreally. 1 month post-injection BCVA improved to 6/12, but OCT and even color photo showing persistent submacular hemorrhage. FFA was done, which showed a hyperfluorescence surrounded by the block fluorescence. She received second dose of injection ranibizumab. Post-injection 7 days, since there was persistent hemorrhage, so C3F8 was injected. Then 1 month later, ICG was done, which did not show any polyp or BVN. So provisional diagnosis of retinal artery macroaneurysm or AMD was made, and third dose of ranibizumab was given. She received 2 more injections of ranibizumab and vision improved to 6/9. The second case of a 75-year-old lady, known hypertensive, came with decreased vision more than 1 month with finger counting at 1 meter distance, showing a large old submacular hemorrhage. You can see the yellow color altered blood, and there is FFA showing retinal artery macroaneurysm. OCT showing dense submacular hemorrhage, and she was treated with injection C3F8 100% with injection TPA intravitreally and anti-VEGF. But after 2 weeks post-injection, there was not much of improvement. So injection C3F8 was re-injected. So the progress, not progressing. Slide. Stuck here. So the vitrectomy was planned with subretinal TPA with injection C3F8 and aflibercept. This video is showing 25-Hz vitrectomy with this same patient with submacular hemorrhage. Following vitrectomy, tricot was injected to see the PVD status. A specialized cannula was made, a 30-gauge cannula introduced to the 24-gauge cannula, and subretinal TPA was injected in the largest part of the submacular hemorrhage. Hemostasis was secured, and fluid air exchange was done, and exchange with 14% C3F8. and aflibercept was given. So subsequently, 2 more aflibercept was given and vision improved to 6/18, and there was complete resolution of submacular hemorrhage. Case 3 was a 73-year-old male, known diabetic, with sudden decrease in vision in the right eye, came with finger counting vision, showing FFA showing stipple hyperfluorescence. ICG showed cluster of polyp, and OCT showing huge PED with submacular hemorrhage. He was treated with injection ranibizumab with injection C3A intravitreally with strict prone positioning. Post-injection, patient developed RPE with breakthrough vitreous hemorrhage. Ultrasound is showing multiple vitreous echoes and subretinal echoes. So pars plana vitrectomy was done with injection C3A followed by ranibizumab. So 1 month post second injection, BCVA improved to 2/60 only, but there was complete resolution of submacular hemorrhage. So in summary, all the 3 cases with a different presentation, but anatomical success could be achieved. TPA was not used in all cases. Functional success was variable depending on the diagnosis and presentation. So visual prognosis was better in patient with shorter duration and lesser retinal damage. Anatomical success could be achieved. Subretinal TPA was very effective in long-standing cases, especially when intravitreal failed. Relatively less complication other than 1 patient having breakthrough vitreous hemorrhage or an RPE rib. So to conclude, timely intervention is essential. Intravitreal gas is effective in displacement of blood but may require multiple injection. Anti-VEGF has a big role in treating the underlying pathology. TPA is effective in dissolution of blood clot but may not be mandatory. Subretinal TPA is more effective and safe in refractory cases. A visual prognosis ultimately depends on the underlying pathology, sub-RP, blood, duration, size, and the available facility. Thank you.
That is an excellent talk by Dr. Shubhankar Sipal. I think the questions whichever is there, we can discuss later, and we can go to Dr. Naresh Babu for the surgical management of submacular hemorrhage. Dr. Naresh, sir, please.
Abhijit, can you ask him to stop sharing? Yes. Abhijit, can you see the slides? Audible?
Yeah. Very good.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Abhijit, for giving me this opportunity. Again, all my co-instructors. So, there is nothing financially to disclosure as far as this presentation is concerned. Dr. Shubhankar Sipal has already discussed a lot about the submacular hemorrhage, but it's nothing wrong in recapping that. It's basically the blood which is located in the potential space between the RPE and the neurosensory retina actually, and it can occur under the RPE also, but when it occurs under the RPE, then managing that hemorrhage becomes difficult, and such cases have got a very bad prognosis. And again, a recap, these are the common causes which can cause the subretinal hemorrhage, but now we come across a lot of PCV cases going in for subretinal hemorrhage very often. And usually that PCV cases will have subretinal as well as vitreous hemorrhage, and the vitreous hemorrhage becomes dehemoglobinized much earlier in case of PCV compared to the rest of the vitreous hemorrhage, and the subretinal hemorrhage also is like a clot. The clot is so bad, like it is sort of a amorphous and calcified clot in these cases. And this can also happen as a complication of surgical procedures, especially like scleral buckling when you're taking a too deeper bite, or when you're draining the subretinal fluid. Or we can have this inadvertent, scleral perforation when you're doing a glaucoma valve surgeries or when you're doing squint surgeries. And associated sometimes with the melanoma during the radioactive procedures. And when you are hitting the retina hard while doing a barrage or a PRP, you can hear the crackling noise, and that can lead to the choroidal rupture and can lead to subretinal hemorrhage. But usually that can be arrested by giving pressure on the eye using either your thumb or using your contact lens, which is used for doing the laser. And of course, the other causes for the penetrating ocular trauma. But in case of penetrating ocular trauma, it can be associated with suprachoroidal hemorrhage. But in these cases, you don't operate immediately because wait for at least 10 to 15 days so that the suprachoroidal blood lyses. So when you drain it, it is easy for us to drain. Otherwise, if you take them immediately, the clotted blood is not going to be evacuated from the suprachoroidal space actually. So usually the submacular TV has got a better visual acuity at the end compared to the neovascular AMD because many a times the lesions does not involve the fovea, and the progression of the CNVM is also lesser, and the rate of disciform scarring is less rapid in case of PCV compared to the neovascular AMD. Again, this is again we are re-emphasizing. So whenever you come across, you try to intervene in less than 24 hours because a permanent damage starts happening within 24 hours, and that may be because of the traction damage secondary to the fibrin deposit under the retina, or because of the toxicity of the iron itself, or because of the clot attraction that leads to the shearing stress on the photoreceptors. So whenever you come across a subretinal hemorrhage, go for early intervention. And these are the grades of subretinal hemorrhage. It can be either a small one or a medium or large or a massive and a hemorrhagic retinal detachment. So when you say it's small, it is up to 4 disc diameters, and if it's more than 4 and not beyond the temporal arcade, you can call it as a medium, and when it goes beyond the temporal vascular arcade, you call it as large or a massive. And subretinal hemorrhagic RDs are quite often seen, and it extends up to the ora at least in more than 2 quadrants. In these cases, our approach is usually a 2-staged surgery where you just go do the vitrectomy, inject the PFCL and wait for a week or so that all the blood comes into the vitreous cavity and the AC, and then we go for the second surgery. Again, the grade also depends according to thickness, thin or a thick. If it is less than 500 micron, it's called as a thin subretinal hemorrhage, and more than 500 is a thick hemorrhage. And you know very well, thin will carry a better prognosis. So these are the prognosticating factors when you're operating on a patient with subretinal hemorrhage. So if it's a small surface area, it's good. A smaller CFT is better, and better base. I mean, if the patient has got a better visual acuity at the baseline, at diagnosis, will have a better visual acuity at 6 months, and the hemorrhages of 2 weeks duration or less is better prognostic eyes, and eye with a good visual acuity prior to the hemorrhage also will behave well after the surgery. The poor factors will be presence of a CNV, presence of neovascular AMD, eyes with relatively thick hemorrhage at the fovea, and the hemorrhage is extending larger than 3 or more disc areas in the greatest linear dimension, or if the hemorrhage is more than 2 weeks duration and poor baseline vision. So when these factors are there, still we'll take them for surgery, but we'll have to give a poor prognosis, and the expectation should be reduced prior to the surgery. So the approaches to the submacular hemorrhages are, first one is when we talk about the indication, the patient should have had at least some useful vision prior to the development of subretinal hemorrhage and significantly reduced vitreous hemorrhage. And as I said earlier, the duration should be less than 30 days. And if it is thin, you can manage that with the TPA and what you call the gas, but the thickness should be more than 500 micron. And see to that the RP and the neurosensory retina is healthy before taking them for surgery. If these things are not there, and if you see who are all the patients who are going to not benefit from the surgery, is the patient with poor visual acuity in the affected eye, even before the development of subretinal hemorrhage, or if the thin subretinal hemorrhage is there, or if there is an underlying RP which is atrophic, and if the overlying NSR is also atrophic, you cannot expect good results in these cases. And large subfoveal sub-RP hemorrhage, as we have discussed earlier, is also going to carry a poor prognosis. So the treatment options are, if it is going to be a very thin hemorrhage, you can go for observation, and usually these thin hemorrhages are caused because of the bleeding from the lacquer cracks in case of myopia or POHS or angioid cases. And we can go for vitrectomy with manual removal of the clot, or we can go for TPA, which has already been discussed by Dr. Subankar. So these things I will be skipping because there's a pneumatic displacement with anti-VEGF and other things have been already discussed. So usually we go for a vitrectomy with clot evacuation. Usually the vitrectomy is same standard 3-port pars plana vitrectomy. And we will go for a large retinotomy. Usually it extends throughout temporal 180-degree. And then you fold the retina over the nasal retina, go under the retina and remove the clot with the forceps or cutter, do a fluid air exchange. After repositioning the retina, then it should be treated like a giant retinal tear. Of course, usually the visual improvement in these cases is limited to only 30 to 50% of the cases. Not all are going to improve. And as associated with any vitrectomy surgery, you will have complications like retinal detachment or PVR changes or cataract or recurrent submacular hemorrhage. And the use of TPA is also advocated, but TPA is useful only if the clot is fresh. If the clot is dehemoglobinized, usually the TPA never acts. So in case of a clotted blood, there is no role for the TPA. And we can go for the gas also. The most important thing is positioning is important, or subretinal air along with TPA can also be used actually. So we will skip all these things because it has already been discussed. This is a case of choroidal rupture following trauma. We know that there are two types of choroidal rupture, either a direct or an indirect. And this is an indirect choroidal rupture, which usually happens concentric to the disc in the posterior pole. And fortunately, in this case, you can find there is a very thin film of subretinal hemorrhage. Fovea is spared. So we went ahead with the gas injection in this case, and over a period of time, you can see the choroidal tear temporal to the fovea. The patient recovered vision, but still will be having scotoma because of that choroidal. So when we come into our topic per se, the basic rationale for submacular hemorrhage is to remove the subretinal blood and to minimize the further damage to the photoreceptors because of the presence of the blood, and to prevent the rebleed and to replace the RP in case if it is atrophic. So many times you don't need to do that, but if there is any RP atrophy under the retina, I mean macula, you can always go for the RP replacement. So this is one of the cases where you can see, as I have told, it's a massive subretinal bleed, and you can see that it appears more like a subretinal mass lesion. And usually in these cases, a complete vitrectomy is mandatory. You can find that there is a thin film of vitreous which is stuck onto the retina. So unless otherwise we stain that with triamcinolone stent, we are not going to identify. And if we are not going to identify and remove, leave it, there is every chance that PVR change is going to happen. Usually we use 44 gauge needle for raising the bleb of retina. This can be done with automated system. What we usually do is we fill the silicone oil injector with the BSS, and then it is connected to the silicone oil injector just under the retina. See to that your plane is perfect. You should not go under the RP. After you raise the bleb in all four quadrants, do a fluid air exchange so that all the the bubbles will coalesce to settle posteriorly, and under the air you can see the periphery better. Go for a 180-degree diathermy, and then you can do retinectomy and fold the retina gently. Usually I use diamond dusted scraper to fold the retina. So once the retina is folded onto the nasal retina, you can see that there is a massive clot. This clot can be removed just by teasing with, you can make out the clot so massive, you can remove it with the forceps. Yes. Many times, if it is associated with membrane, the membrane is chewy. Actually, sometimes it's very difficult. We have to remove through anti-segment also. Once this is done, you re-inject the PFCL. You can see how it has to be treated like a
mute the buzzer, please.
Like a giant retinal tear. You go for at least 2 or 5 to 10 layers. In this case, we usually go for 2 stage. First, we inject PFCL, fill it with topped up oil. And maybe 5 to 7 days later, when the retina settles very well, you can find now this is the second stage after 5 days. So we are doing additional laser. You can find the retina very well attached. Now you go in for a complete fluid air exchange by removing the PFCL as well as the silicone oil, and you can see the macula. Now fill it with silicone oil. Usually the silicone oil is removed in 3 to 5 months time. This is another case. For want of time, I'll not go in for that. So this is the post of the previous case. You can find that the massive clot has been completely removed, and this is the first POD. Over a period of time, this is another case. Again, we'll skip that for want of time. These are the cases where we have done a submacular surgery. You can find out the temporal 180-degree retinectomy, which appears like a giant retinal tear, and a massive lasers done for a GRT, and there is a slight sparing of the fovea. So most of these cases improve very well. This is another case where we have left this thing. So this is the previous case where you can find after the removal, there are few clots still remaining, but the foveal contour or the retinal contour to some extent is fine. And in this case, in spite of doing that, we couldn't identify the atrophy of the RP. So if you would have identified on the table, we could have gone in for what you call the RP transplant. So in conclusion, as far as the subretinal hemorrhage is concerned, the natural history is variable and depends largely on the etiology of the submacular hemorrhage. Usually, if they are associated with PCV, the prognosis is good, but in case of CNV, usually it is poor. And that is because of the membrane as well as the atrophy of the RP as well as the hemorrhage. And there is very minimal benefit now compared to observation in case due to CNV, due to AMD, but the advantage of PCV is much better. So it is better to go for early intervention whenever you come across a submacular hemorrhage in case of PCV. And an alternative surgical procedure is in case if there is a macular atrophy, I mean of the RP, you can go for macular translocation or RP grafting under the macular area. Usually the response may be mixed, but usually they do well with this. So with that, I would like to thank Dr. Abhijit for giving me this opportunity. I'm concluding this. Any questions is welcome. Thank you. Thank you, Abhijit. And all these surgeries were performed with our Ingenuity 3D system, which is a 3D vitrectomy operating system. Thank you.
Fantastic slides, Dr. Naresh, and the nice picture of the surgery avatar.
Thank you, thank you.
Excellent. So can I call Dr. Saravanan to
I think we don't have much time. So unfortunately, our stream is not live on AIOS website because of some glitch. Anyway, nice talks from all of the participants.
But somebody has written it's already sorted out and no.
Initially, almost the 80% of the talks are not working. Dr. Amit also called me up, told that Dr. Podwal, Amit Podwal, that we sorted, but it is already too late.
Yeah.
So yes, sir, please sum it up, and then we can discuss some.
I don't think we have much time.
No, it is still there. About 15 minutes time.
Okay then.
5:25.
Okay. So questions will be that George will be like, when do you, how do you decide what maneuver to use when you're dealing with a recurrent macular hole? What are the factors which you would factor in to decide whether to go with a inverse flap or a free flap, or how do you lens or autograft? How do you decide which to go?
Yeah, no, for a inverse flap basically, or the temporal flap which Dr. Abhijit showed, is basically for large macular holes, and basically only to prevent the failure of surgery, especially more than 800 microns of minimum hole diameter in large holes. So my preferred technique is the modified under PFCL free flap technique. But the problem happens in routine cases like emmetropic patients, pseudophakic patients. Routine cases would be under PFCL from the edge of the peeled area, ILM free flap technique. And long-acting gas tamponade. But then this capsular flap is done, especially in high myopic patients and getting already the first surgery due to vitreous crisis, and getting the ILM was difficult. So that those cases with some viscoelastic, this capsular flap would be quite easy procedure. You don't have to struggle to get a ILM flap in a tessellated background staphylomatous eye. Even if it, I think the last technique that described, the full thickness retinal flap technique, I think we have, I mean, I have limited experience in full thickness retinal flap only in some re-RD cases where the retinal detachment associated with macular hole. So only in such situation I have done, but then for staphylomatous macular holes, this retinal free flap technique would be useful. I would like to have comments from you and Dr. Naresh also.
Yeah, Naresh, you want to-
Sir, George has to answer one more part. How does he do the radial or the arcuate incisions in the retina?
Okay, arcuate retina nobody does in current scenario. It was one of the earlier techniques described by Dr. Steve
Yeah,
Charles.
actually, there is no, I mean, it is done using MVR or the side port thing, but the problem is there, it doesn't cause scarring, but the problem is, you have to be very, Steve Charles' hands, it works beautifully. He has published actually. But the thing is, the question of not injuring the RP is also important there. What is the depth of these incisions? Because if you have an intraoperative OCT, probably I would think this is one indication that will really help you to know the depth of your, C-shaped arcuate retinotomy. You know at what depth you are creating this incision, because it's very easy technique, because you are creating a C-shaped temporal incision and with soft tip you are just pushing it nasally. But the depth of the incision, you need experience. Probably I don't have any experience in retinotomy, macular retinotomy, C-shaped retinotomy. You'll have to ask for further details to Dr. Steve Charles only. And I would like Dr. Naresh and Dr. Saravanan to comment on that retinal free flap technique, at least for staphylomatous high myopic macular.
Autograph.
Autograph, right? Full thickness, yeah.
Full thickness
retinal.
autograph, yes. Okay, Naresh, you want to?
Yeah, full thickness we usually do for the large macular hole. Otherwise, most of the time it is reserved for our what do you call the reopened macular holes. Not as a primary procedure in most of the time. And second thing is, like, there are people who are claiming that they are getting a very good multifocal ERG, but we have never got any such in any of these cases. Yes, there is a marginal improvement in these cases, because it other what do you call ILM flaps, it acts like a scaffold for the hole to close, but visual acuity as such is not that great, number one. And number two, when we're talking about this inverse flap technique, I think we had a paper published, and at the same time L.V. Prasad had a published paper. They had 800 as the cutoff and we had 600 as the cutoff. Actually, the finding of both the papers were similar. It closes the hole, but when you anatomically, but when you take functionally, visual acuity with or without a flap, there is not much of difference. And as you will be knowing very well, actually for the last almost 3-4 years, we have been using this PRP for macular holes. Now we have started using PRP for reopened macular holes and for OD pits also. But only the thing is, making that PRP, that is a platelet-rich plasma, is a cumbersome procedure, takes almost 25 to 30 minutes, and you need a very good trained assistant to do that. Otherwise, that's a very non-invasive way of closing the reopened macular hole and large macular holes.
So I have Saravanan, sir.
No, Dr. Saravanan has an experience on, I think at least in staphylomatous.
Two cases I had. One was where there was a unintended injury near the nasal side of the hole, and the hole had lifted up and become very large following a routine macular hole surgery. And another was a one-eyed myope that I think I showed in my talk where I had placed autograph. That patient did very nice actually. She had more than.
That's what I was actually commenting on, because when you have an extreme myopic staphyloma and already failed ILM peeling, then getting the ILM is a challenge, no? For a free flap of ILM, getting the ILM is very, very difficult. You see only the scleral, even the staining is so poor. So if you get a retinal free flap, probably your procedure is becomes much more easier, isn't it?
Yeah, one more case of attached retina with myopic macular posterior cephaloma. That patient got 618 actually. I was myself was very surprised. The second patient, both myopes did very well. She had around 624 parts, 1/8 patient. Other was again 1/8 patient. That also got 618, young patient. Somehow in myopic case, I would, surprisingly, even myself was surprised. Karan was actually he was screaming.
Yeah, because Dr. Dilraj Grewal also he has published this full thickness retinal flap basically for all myopic staphylomatous macular holes.
Yeah.
Sir,
How the vascularization happens in this free flaps? Because
probably it is taken by the RP and something, because I don't think there is, I don't know, somebody has to do a high speed OCT, I'm sorry.
Find the vascularity of the flaps.
OCTA and then demonstrate the circulation happening within the deposited retina. So maybe.
Sabran sir,
Yeah.
tell me, in the last VRSI, we had seen one technique that here the doctor was injecting subretinal or intraretinal fluid and making the macular hole very small.
Yeah.
Have you tried this?
I have not. They are trying to induce localized RD and then making the retina loose and then reattaching and trying to decrease the size of.
No, he just showed that he injected and made it edematous so that the hole was almost closed, and then just gas tamponade and left it on. Did you try this?
No.
And one comment that the free flap technique, I'm usually using this viscoelastic to keep it in place.
Yeah.
So that works very well for me at least. Otherwise, I was losing flap in the, either in the cannula or in the forceps itself or somewhere it was lost.
Large hole basis, I think, as I have seen, I don't know, Dr. Saravanan and George and others also, Rajesh, that if the amount of ILM is smaller also, like 1/3 of the size, even the retinal tissue also, like myopic, I have harvested some retina from the periphery and below PFCL, I put it there. Somehow that forms a nidus for the tissue migration and it helps in closure. It is not that we have to get it a correct size and something. What is the
No. The thing is that not only is like I had one case of acute retinal necrosis where vitrectomy was done and developed a secondary macular hole following surgery. I mean, not immediately, after 3-4 months. Again, we put a graft. When she came in, she had 560 and she improved almost. She came to 636. So to almost 2-line improvement was there. She was also subjectively she was very happy. So I think some role is there. In this case, the retina never filled up the gap. Only the graft was still sitting in the same place which I placed. So it's not like just like a scaffold like you do on a lens capsule or an inverse flap. I think the retina has got some role to play. Probably future studies may throw some light on that.
even
Yeah, before this full thickness retinal flap, actually there was no other than ILM. There was no other option. So that was where the capsular flap came in as a scaffold for this thing. So, but as mentioned, the full thickness retinal free flap would be more, something else to do than a scaffold effect, probably.
Sir, something comes to my mind. These micropulse lasers, do they have any role in macular hole? Can one try? Subthreshold micropulse.
Some of the older cases, before ILM peeling and vitrectomy, people doing a barrage around the macular hole. That I have seen. I have seen 2 cases where the macular hole had been barraged for whatever logic I don't know. I don't know about micropulse.
Because micropulse should not work ideally in macular hole, in idiopathic macular hole, where we are thinking of a tractional element. Because micropulse is aimed basically to, stimulate the RP so that, the fluid absorbs and all these things actually. But how it closing a macular hole is...
it's there, so we should wrap it up now.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the last thing, Rajesh, you can do a randomized trial of ILM flap, ILM peeling with or without micropulse laser.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was just wondering.
You can do it.
I mean, have you done anything, Naresh?
No, it's a good idea. We'll try actually. Why not?
I don't have a micropulse laser. I just heard it.
We have that.
Because the exact mechanism how micropulse acts is not clearly known. So it is supposed to stimulate a lot of healing factors, including tumor necrosis alpha, and a lot of factors.
The
Maybe
problem is the endpoint. We don't know the endpoint.
the surgical outcome. We don't know.
Okay.
Okay, sir.
Okay.
Then thanks to everybody.
Thank you,
And
Chairperson.
we hope
Thanks, Abhijit, for having all of us on, one platform, one day, one time. Great.
And next year we'll meet again.
Sure.
okay, I will contact you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone, for this brilliant session.
Thank you.
Abhijit, sir, thank you.
Dr. Priyam is a budding retina surgeon. He's already seasoned fellow with
Okay.
in Calcutta. only.
Oh, great.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Abhijit.
It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay, bye everybody.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, sir. Thank you, sir.